sitting on my chest. And I was like,
Well, I'll see when they show up again.
Oh.
If they want people who had polio, did that.
Oh, I bet you're right. Kind of bites.
They must have done well.
Thank you.
Thought I'd start out by just telling you a little bit about our protected area program. So we have properties throughout Kansas and even one in Nebraska. And they're all situated so that we can support wildlife, but also have places where people can connect with nature near where they are. Our vision is a series of properties throughout the state so that there's high quality wildlife habitat throughout the state, but also places where people can connect with wildlife close to where they are. So we currently have protected areas, one in Nebraska, which is our Hutton Niobrara Ranch Wildlife Sanctuary. It's 5,000 acres along the Niobrara River. It offers cattle ranching, so we show how cattle ranching can be compatible with wildlife, but it also has mountain lion and elk and sharp-tailed grouse, and so that's a wonderful scenic property. We have another property, the Acterberg Wildlife Friendly Demonstration Farm near Lincoln, Kansas. That one is mostly row crop agricultural farm, but there's this beautiful riparian area through the middle of it that has wonderful winding woods, and we've added grassland buffer strips, and now it supports Connie Acterberg's favorite bird, the bobwhite quail. And then the Mount Mitchell Heritage Prairie Park, along with the Mount Mitchell Prairie Guards. That one is maintained as a public park, but it also has some of the best tallgrass prairie habitat you're going to find in the Flint Hills. It's just south of Wamego, Kansas. And it also honors Captain William Mitchell, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. So all of our properties are unique. And I'm so excited to have this property being added to the Audubon of Kansas Protected Areas program because it's going to have a wonderful hiking trail that you're going to experience a little bit later today with these wonderful bur oak trees, and other parts of the property have a really nice grassland habitat with so much diversity of wildflowers. There's a pond on the northern part. I mean, this property just has so many different aspects to make it valuable for wildlife, and now even more valuable for people through this hiking trail that will be provided. And so, this property and the beauty of this property didn't just happen. It takes landowners and people that own the land, that care about it, that nurture the habitat. And so, for example, this hiking trail's been a passion of Gary's, and it takes a lot of upkeep to keep up a hiking trail and keep it open with windstorms and tornadoes and just regular falling. And the Kendall family, this has been in the Kendall family for a number of years, and you'll hear more about that later, but they're stewards of this property, and it really is, Audubon of Kansas is honored that we can help honor the Kendall family's legacy with this property, and make sure that we're highlighting all the work that they've done. I also like to thank Gary specifically. He's been a supporter of Audubon of Kansas through many different ways. He's been on the chair of the board for a number of years. He just recently circulated off, and as he was chair of the board, he really fostered Audubon of Kansas through change in the executive director, the hiring of staff, and now our expansion of our protected areas program. And so I do want to just pause and give a special thank you to Gary for all your work as a volunteer. It's truly amazing. And then, to recognize Gary and Carolyn, both, the Kendall family that has a history on this property, and it's been a process to make this an Audubon of Kansas protected area. We really try to make sure that we're going to honor the donor's legacy when we accept this property. And so I'm just so honored that Gary and Carolyn have chosen Audubon of Kansas to help preserve their legacy. And a thank you for choosing us. We do have a little gift, so if you could come up, Gary and Carolyn, and we have something to present to you. And here it comes. So, these hiking sticks aren't just hiking sticks. You helped get them.
Yes,
So why don't you tell a little bit about the hiking stick?
I did. As a memento to thank the Hadens for this generous donation, I went out into the forest here and I cut 2 bitternut hickory trees and took them to a local artist and woodworker in Lawrence, Kansas named Matt Roman, who fashioned them into just gorgeous walking sticks. That way, Gary and Carolyn will always have a piece of the property with them.
We're going to get a picture.
Nice, good photo.
So next, Gary Haden's going to talk about this property and what makes it so special.
Is this coming through okay? Good. Well, I met Carolyn the summer before she came to K-State. Her oldest brother, Larry, was the pledge trainer in my fraternity, and I was the pledge at that time because I was in a scholarship house 2 years before I joined the fraternity. And I didn't particularly care for that brother because he was the pledge trainer. But I had good friends from out at Canopolis, Ellsworth area where I was from, and they were in the fraternity, and they wanted to come and see Larry, so I tagged along and met Carolyn, and then we started dating when she came up to Manhattan that fall to K-State. When we go to the Friends of the Library, sometimes we'll end up at the same room where I first saw her after she came up to K-State, and then we started dating. So it was just, she was talking to her cousin, who was another Larry Kendall, but from Kendalls Grove, but they were, I don't know, third cousins or whatever they were. But Larry went on to become a very famous real estate developer out in Colorado, that Larry. And her brother Larry worked for Purina Mills and other places, and they lived in St. Louis at the time. And Larry, the property was deeded to Larry when he was 6 years old, which caused quite a family rift, and because there were others that thought that the property should have gone to somebody else. But Uncle Ted, as everyone knew him, or Stiffy, as everybody in the family called him, because he'd had a stroke when he was a younger person, he liked Larry, and Larry was the oldest son, and so by gosh, at 6 years old, Larry became owner of this property. Well, Larry and his family lived in Oklahoma for the longest time, and then also in St. Louis, and never had a chance to get back to it, and Larry didn't know what to do with it, and so we had property out in where I grew up for my mother, and so eventually we sold that property out there to my brother, and then we took that money and bought this property. I had hunted this property. Carolyn and I met in '64, I guess, and we got married in '67, and for the longest time I hunted quail and pheasants and so forth around here. But this was always kind of, I'd hunt down here, but it was too wooded for quail. You know, there weren't that many, so I didn't hunt that much, and I didn't really know the property that as well as I should. But I was always, around it, and so when it became available, we had looked at some other property we were hoping to buy, and that fell through. So we thought, well, this is a pretty nice property. And then I came down here and found out just how spectacular it was. And then I opened it up by putting a nature trail in. And it's amazing. You can go 50 feet into the trees, and it's a totally different world than it is walking around the edge. And that's kind of what I found, and it really made a difference. And I felt really bad because at the time we purchased the property in 2011, the beaver they had killed a lot of the oaks farther up the creek. they would just girdle them in the wintertime when they didn't have anything else to eat, and they'd take the bark off and kill the trees. And so, since then we got a responsibility for these trees. And I had loved trees, just kind of inherent. Remember crying when we would have cut down trees in our yard back in central Kansas, where trees were usually, American, not American elms, but Siberian elms or something that had grown fast and so forth. And my first memory is when I was 4, and my family planted a shelter belt, and they'd go along on this equipment and take the trees and just drop them in this row, and then so they had like a row of Russian olives and a row of eastern cedars, which are now verboten because they spread so badly. And then a couple of rows of elm trees and so forth. So I had always liked trees, and then I realized here we had something really special in terms of the trees. And so Carolyn and I started talking in terms of, how can we preserve these? A lot of the oaks in the northern property we have up here, which is larger property, they were cut in the 50s for barrel staves. And I don't know if oak is big for making bourbon. And so they would cut these, and they would make big 50-gallon barrels or whatever of oak, and then they would set those on fire inside to char them, and then they would age the Jack Daniels or whatever they were making in those oak barrels for several years, and then you'd have the premier bourbons and so forth. And then some of those nowadays, they ship them on to France or whatever, and they'll age wine in them, or they'll age maybe European beers in them and so forth. But generally in those days, they would just make the oak barrel, and then they would use it one time. They couldn't use it again, and then it would just be destroyed. So that's how a lot of the oaks on the other property were. There's still some really nice places up there, but nothing like this. For whatever reason, Carolyn's father never wanted to log this or have it logged as he had some of the other property. I think it was I don't think it was anything Larry had necessarily said, because, as I say, Larry started with the property when he was 6 years old, so he wasn't really in touch with what was going on. So it was just kind of like Carolyn's dad, I think, just deferred to the thought that, well, whatever Larry wants to do when he's older, he can do it, but I'm not going to make that decision, which was a good thing. So anyway, I put nature trails in here, and then we thought, well, God, we need to save this on a permanent basis, because it is special in Kansas. There's not that many places you can just get out of your car and walk up a trail and be in the midst of oak trees like this. And there's big walnut trees and other hackberries and so forth also. And Clark's Creek has got, the beaver, Hadens for cutting down oaks or killing oaks, but also they raise the water level, so you got ducks on here in the wintertime, and you've got a lot of deer. And Justin, he's a bow hunter deer on here, and then he also helped us with the picnic table, because he had the log sawed up by a guy in Kendalls Grove who does sawing for people. So that's where the picnic table came from, an oak tree that had fallen down. Unfortunately, they're aging out like I am. Only they age about 160 years, and I'm only going to be about half that. But so we do have one every now and then will die. They just kind of die from the roots up, and the roots just kind of rot away, and then the tree falls over. So every now and then we'll have a big oak tree to decide what to do with, whether we make a picnic table out of it or, give it to somebody. The locals like them because the oaks are used for lining trailer beds for cattle and so forth, because they're heavy duty, they last a long time, and you can just kind of cut them to fit if you have somebody that's got a saw. And there's another sawyer in the area that's got a portable saw, and we've had him saw things for us too. So that's something where the local people have helped out a lot with the sawing and the getting things ready. And then Craig and Carrie Granzo, Carrie's our tenant, and Craig's his brother. They live a mile west and a mile north, the two of them. And they had post hole diggers, so they dug the post holes for the picnic table. And Sam cut the hedge trees, and so they're hedge trees, which the termites won't bother, because they can't. It's hard for them too, and so they're in the ground. But you got to cut them and then you got to work with them while they're still green. Otherwise, you can't drive a nail into them. So we cut them and then drilled holes in the oak that had been stored in Justin's barn, and so then we could drive spikes into them. And so that's how that whole table came about recently. Sam and I have talked about doing another, Sam Richards back here. He's our Kansas Protected Areas Manager for Audubon of Kansas. And he's wonderful to have because he's got a lot of energy, and he also knows a lot about plants and birds and everything else too. And I think it's probably worked in every state west of the Mississippi. I'm not sure, but it seems like he had all sorts of jobs in California and other states out west and so forth. So he's got a lot of experience in trail building and so forth. And I'm very confident that he'll keep the trail up. Something that was mentioned earlier, it is difficult to keep a nature trail. There's just always a tree falling down or something. The oak back here that you drive in that snapped off, that was a result of the tornado in April of 2022. We had 3 major storms that year that broke off trees and so forth. The tornado went through on the north end of the property, and even so twisted off this tree down here. And you'll see on the nature trail different places where you'll see big trees that were snapped off by the tornado. So anyway, we started looking. We said, okay, how are we going to protect this? I had known Ron Klataski from classes we had together at K-State in the 60s. I knew his activity all those years with Audubon of Kansas, and so I talked to Ron, and I think he was looking for somebody to do more with sanctuaries, and so I think he probably saw 2 things. One, opportunity maybe for some protected area or sanctuaries, we called them at that time, but also a way to get more people involved in sanctuaries in Kansas and kind of spread his vision of having protected areas across the state that would have different habitat but be close enough for people to use them locally and not, Kansas, as you know, is absolutely at the bottom of states as far as public land for people to be out on. And so that's another thing that we think is very important. So we had talked to other people. We talked to K-State. We'd had them out, and one of the people came out and looked and says, "What are we doing here?" And so we didn't think that was probably going to work for us. We had looked at other organizations that would have sold the property right away, because nobody wants to manage land. I mean, it's a complicated process, and people don't like to do it. Back when the Audubon National Audubon Society was getting rid of its regional offices, one of which eventually morphed into Audubon of Kansas. But we had a conference over at the Kansas City airport, and we had, among people there were people from the Kansas City area, and one of them just said flat out, "If anybody offers you land, just run like hell." Because people it's hard to manage. You got to manage people, you got to manage habitat. It's the whole thing. I mean, that's the importance of us being able to have enough funds to hire someone like Sam, who's familiar with habitat, knowledgeable about how to manage habitat. We could have gone to somebody and said, well, we can go to the Kansas Land Trust or another organization and do what they call a conservation easement, which basically says that the property is not going to be changed from what it is. Well, the problem with that is, there's several problems. One, the Kansas legislature from time to time has talked in terms of outlawing conservation easements because they think they deter from economic development. So that's one. Secondly, when you have a conservation easement, you have to give somebody money to look after that after you're gone. Well, that's fine. They may be willing to go to court, but what if somebody's just making a gradual change? What if they're not going out in the pasture and clipping out the cedar trees and the hedge trees and so forth and just letting it grow up to be a mess of second growth and so forth? What if they're not taking care of invasive species? We're very lucky here. We don't have any bush honeysuckle. I don't know how many of you know what that is, but in Lawrence and other places, bush honeysuckle Manhattan also it's just horrible. It's things that once it starts, the birds eat the little red berries, they defecate, and you got another bush honeysuckle coming up, and it just swamps everything. We don't have any of that. We've got a little garlic mustard, which is an invasive, but it's easy to pull up. And they say it's good eating. I've never eaten any garlic mustard, but it's an annual plant that comes up. It's not like a bush or anything. So anyway, we started looking about, okay, who do we talk to? I talked to Ron Klaczewski. He said, well, yeah, we'd be interested. And, if you look at what we did at Hutton Niobrara Ranch, they were the only organization that would say, we will not sell the property. We'll continue to manage it as you want. Unfortunately, Harold Hutton died before they signed the final agreement, so it was left up to his wife, Lucille, to do the final agreement. There were questions about, well, what did Harold really mean when he said there shouldn't be any recreational hunting? So we've had questions, we get too many deer up there. Well, how do we manage them? So what's those are the kinds of things that come up when you're managing property. What do you do with beaver? I love them because they make more water. I hate them because they kill trees, trees that I want to keep, like oak trees. So you got to do some hands-on stuff, like put wire around the trees and so forth. Anyway, Ron got me more involved with Audubon of Kansas. Eventually, I became chairman of the board, and we had some kind of tumultuous times in terms of transitioning from Ron, who had been executive director for 30 years, and the way he did things, and the way new people coming on board, a lot of whom he had solicited, thought things should be managed. And so we went through some tough times, everybody trying to get on the same page and so forth. And when I came, I just said, well, Ron's going to retire. Let's kind of more of a kinder, gentler Audubon of Kansas. And I feel like that's really worked out, and I'm really happy with where we've gotten. And we've got really lucky because we got a couple of bequests that we didn't know anything about, people that we didn't know anything about, and dropped a significant amount of money on us. And so we've been able to add staff, and we feel like we're really in a good position now. And I think it's a growing organization. I feel really great about having it take over this property, because I know from seeing what we've done in Hutton and Nebraska and so forth, how careful people are to adhere to the wishes of the previous donors. Hutton is a pretty amazing place because it does have elk and deer and mountain lions, sharp-tailed grouse, prairie chickens, and so we have people in the spring come and see the grouse and the prairie chickens. And it's kind of a blackout area, so we get people who want to see the night skies and so forth. So, and it's 5,000 acres, so it's a big piece of property. This is kind of more of I don't know how to describe it, but you kind of get a little bit of everything. You got cropland, you got forests to go through. Most places you don't have an opportunity to be this close to the trees and get the feeling of, a canopy over you and so forth. And I've had friends refer to it as old growth forest. Well, I guess it is, because some of it's 160 years old. But it's not common in Kansas. And our fear was somebody would come along. We've got the beautiful hay meadow up here. I could just see somebody saying, well, let's subdivide that. We'll maybe put 4 houses on there and they'll mow everything. And then I could see somebody buying it and say, God, those oaks, I could cut those down, and that would cut into what I owe on the property, so I'd have some cash right away, Well, we had one of our oaks cut inadvertently because the property line on our north property runs right through the creek, and we had a couple of trees on the west side of the creek that got cut. And I called this logger, whatever he was, I guess he's a logger. I called him and said, well, what about the tree? And he says, well, I'll give you $50 for it. Well, it was a tree maybe twice as large as this one. And he says, well, I'll give you $50 for it, Well, that's not the kind of person I want buying our property and leaving it up to them to manage in the long term. So that's where we ended up with Audubon of Kansas, because I knew of their past work. I became more familiar working with them on a regular basis, and I feel very comfortable with where the property will be 10 years down the road, or 50 years down the road, or whoever knows how many years. With global warming, I don't think we know anything about what something's going to look like 100 years down the road. I had the first red-shouldered hawk in Morris County that was reported to Chuck Oddie back when he was keeping track of those things. And so I had red-shouldered hawks. Now they nest in here. They're a coastal species. Typically you find them, you can find them in California, but they're on the coast. You can find them in Texas, Mississippi, Florida, always on the coast. Why? Because the weather's in the winter is moderate. They winter in Kansas now. We have red-shouldered hawks in our neighborhood in Manhattan. They winter there. They raise young there in the summertime. They nest here. They nest on this property. They nest on our northern property. So things are changing. We don't know where they're going to end up, but we do know if you come in and develop a property like this, it's not going to be available for wildlife. Now, another reason that I wanted to do it, and I hunted all my life. I started hunting when I was 6 years old, so I've hunted everything. I've never shot a deer, but I never wanted that much venison in the freezer, and it just wasn't what I wanted to do with a deer. But anyway, it's always been hunted. I've hunted a lot of turkeys down here. I know there's turkeys, and I know when it's turkey season because I start getting calls from people I don't know. Because the turkeys are all out on these fields on both sides of the creek displaying. And they'll say, well, gosh, you got some turkeys. Could I come and hunt your turkeys? And truthfully, most years I had a friend that I thought I might take out turkey hunting. And so it's been easy to say, well, I think I'm going to hunt that later. But some people are very persistent. Some people I've never heard from again, but they'll drive on Highway 4 and it's like, God, there's not as many turkeys as there used to be, but there's a lot of turkeys on that property, and they'll find out who owns it and so forth. So it's interesting in that regard. And we do have an excellent turkey population considering that turkeys are down in Kansas in terms of numbers are concerned, and they don't really know why. It's kind of matured too much for a lot of quail. We do have some occasionally on the northern property where we've got some plum thickets and so forth. I haven't seen any on our west property line over here where there's a filter strip, but I'm pretty sure there's quail in there from time to time. But I don't see them on a regular basis. And they also come in from the property on the east side over here, across the road, because that's pretty good quail habitat. So I'll still see them, but I like to, two things, like to give the birds an opportunity to have some places where they're not molested, and also have places where people can go and have a good chance of seeing wildlife. Because if you walk the nature trail in the spring, you're pretty much likely scaring up a gobbler and some hens, or maybe some hens. Or this time of year, sometimes we'll have a couple of families of a hen and poults in here. And I've been seeing them across the road. And I saw a turkey feather in here this morning, so I know they're still around. And when you're walking the trail, it's not unlikely that you scare up several turkeys at some point today, because for whatever reason, we still have good turkeys on Clark's Creek compared to most of the state. So that's been a good thing. So anyway, this thing, it's kind of like we saw something needed to be done to suit us, and we went through that whole process of eliminating different places and organizations and landing on AOK, and we're very happy we did. So that's all. Anybody have any questions or anything?
Gary, why do you call it Far West Farm? Why is it Far West Farm?
Why Far West Farm? Well, Carolyn's great grandfather's grandfather was the first postmaster at Far West, Kansas, and that was on our other property up north. Now there's dispute because we can't, from the public records available, we don't know exactly where that post office was. Post office was later moved to Latimer. At the time, the post office was called Far West because that post office was the farthest west post office outside of the ones in California in the 1860s. And so that was Far West, Kansas up there. And so that's where Far West Farms comes from, and that's the origin of that. There's an interesting story too, supposedly right on this corner of the intersection up here, supposedly a family of settlers were killed by Indians. We have never been able to document that. It's been written about in different places, but in trying to document it, we've never been able to document it. I don't know. I'm trying to think. Do you know any more about that? Mr. Diekman, I'm looking at you. That's not one that's ever come across? Okay.
Doesn't sound like it.
All right. Roger does a lot of historical stuff and is a writer and educator and so forth, and been very active in the area and trying to work with doing historical stuff and so forth. So I thought maybe you'd heard those stories and so forth. And it never made any sense to me because the Comanche raids, as our friend Raymond Powers here, the expert historian, can tell you, they were all farther west in Kansas at that point. So we don't think it was Comanches. And the Kansas were pretty peaceable considering the way they were treated. So we don't have any reason to believe that it was the Kansa Indians that massacred anybody. So we don't know where the story originated, and we don't really know who's supposedly involved, and we don't know exactly. The second part of that story is that soldiers from Fort Riley came down and on the west side of Clark's Creek, about a mile and a half here, bivouacked while they buried the settlers that were killed. And supposedly people found buckles from their horses and so forth that were when they were bivouacked there during the time that they buried the I think it was supposed to be a couple and their 2 children that died in a cabin here. The cabin was burned down apparently, so, and we don't know who owned it at the time, and it may not have been owned by anybody at that time based on what we know. So anyway, we have discovered that, and Carolyn and I have been working on this frustratingly sometimes to try to figure out exactly who owned what property when and how the transition of the property was and so forth. And so it's still complicated. We're still trying to sort it out. Eventually, when we get the answers, at least to the point we're comfortable, we'll probably talk to AOK and we're going to put up some signage so people will know who the Kendalls were and where the name Kendalls Grove came from and so forth.
Okay, join me in thanking Gary.
This is the first time Jackie has ever encouraged me to quit talking.
Can you introduce Dave then?
Oh, yes, Dave. So this is Dave Kendall. Many of you have heard of him from stage, screen, and television. What'd you say? I can't hear you. Dave is Carolyn's youngest brother. There are 3 brothers, Larry that I mentioned earlier. Jim, who was my age, we actually were roommates at K-State. And then little Davey came along 6 years after the other kids. So this is the little brother here. Yeah. So, but he's famous for being on public television, Sunflower Journeys, etc. Still doing various things. Just finishing up, I guess, the Ranchers of Greenwood County, or whatever the title of that is. But
Something like that.
that's been in the works for quite a while. And he and Rex Buchanan, Rex is. A lot of times helps Dave with interviews and so forth, and then Dave's wife Laura also has been helping with interviews and so forth in some of the programs. So anyway, if you want to know anything about history, Raymond Powers is your guy. He's former head of the Kansas Historical Society. His wife Eva and I worked together at the Kansas Corporation Commission. So I had interviewed Raymond because I was working as a reporter for the Wichita Eagle. They were building the Wolf Creek nuclear plant, so I would always try to go to him to get the straight information as to what was going on in the legislature, which, of course, is never entirely possible. At the table behind them, Mike Lennon with the black cap, which is very fitting, actually. He was a director of the Kansas Corporation Commission. And to his side is Don Lowe, who was the Director of Utilities. Carolyn worked for Don when he was Director of Utilities Division. And then sitting at the same table is Diane Lowe, one-time Kansas Teacher of the Year, very famous person also, especially. So I've got some friends from all sorts here, dog walkers and so on and so forth. So anyway, I greatly appreciate everybody showing up, and anybody has any questions when I'm alone or whatever, don't hesitate to come up and ask.
And if you talk to Gary afterwards and he's kind of distracted somehow, you might know that he had a knee replacement surgery a while back, and he's still having this post-surgery delusional sort of whatever it is, where you see things that don't really exist in real life, and it kind of zips through the corner of his eyes, and it's kind of like, what was that? And it was nothing, but Gary's perceptions are telling him that there's something flying through like a little airplane or a butterfly. So normally he's pretty sane, but if he's a little bit off today, understand that he's still under some delusional properties from this post-surgery situation. Anyhow, as he said, I'm Dave Kendall, Carolyn's younger brother, and we have two older brothers, Jim and Larry, and I just have to say that we're all very happy to see this taking place. We're kind of amazed because none of the rest of us would probably have thought of doing this, but it's a great solution to this situation of how to keep it accessible to the rest of the family, since it's going to be something that we can all access. And for me, that's one of the most important things, to be able to come back down here and kind of feel like I'm being, in tune with the ancestors again. And as Gary says, it goes back, actually, Far West Farm. Somebody asked where the title comes from, Far West Farm. And actually, I did a Sunflower Journey story about that a number of years ago. So there's an 8-minute version that'll be longer than what I should say here. But it goes back to about, 1857, and it wasn't the Kendalls, it was the Walters. William Marion Walter, our great-great-grandfather, walked out here from Kentucky and got a job hauling freight on the Santa Fe Trail. And he came through Council Grove in 1857, which was the year, if you notice, on the Hayes House, it says 1857. So he was here at the same time when the Hayes House was built. So he came through, made at least one trip to Santa Fe, and in the process noticed that it looked like pretty fertile ground around this part. So he came back here, and a couple years later bought this land primarily north of us. There's two sections of property here. The north property is where he settled, and that was in 1859. And so he established himself there. He built a log cabin. First year he didn't have it quite finished in the wintertime, and so he ended up staying in a cabin that's now also in Council Grove. If you go to the Trail Days Museum there in Council Grove, there's a barn that covers over a 2-story log cabin. That was the Stephen Atkinson cabin that was out here. And our great-great-grandfather spent part of the winter lodging with him because he hadn't finished his cabin yet. So we have the Atkinsons to thank for that. But anyhow, that was the beginning, the first land that our family owned out here, and that was in 1859. And as Gary said, he got appointed postmaster, and we got official certificates from the U.S. Postmaster General, 1864, where he was identified as the postmaster of Far West, Kansas. And if you see maps, I've got a map where there's Council Grove and Far West on the Morris County, and that there are not too many other communities listed from that point in time. And you think Far West, Kansas here, and at the time it was Far West. The settlement hadn't established too much farther south or west of here. So it's kind of an interesting connection there. He built his log cabin, like I said, a few years later. They had one child, which was unusual because most farm families and pioneers had to have more than one, but they had one that survived. And she grew up and married the first Kendall that comes into the picture, William Marion Kendall, who was born 3 months after Kansas entered the Union in 1861, south of Lawrence in a little township called Willow Springs. And they moved out here, raised kids. So that was the generation where there were, I think they bought some land in this area closer to this property and raised 7 kids, and they all farmed around here. And as things go, a lot of families have lost touch with their family farming traditions, and that's kind of what happened with the Kendall clan. From like 7 kids farming in this area, it was down to where my dad was kind of the last of his generation to farm. And then when he retired in the early 80s, I was the last one that was kind of in line to take over as he retired. And it was really a tough decision to give up that opportunity to keep it in the family. But, you know, even though I liked being out in nature and doing farm work, I never really paid much attention to what it took to be a farmer. And I realized, especially in 1980 with the farm crisis going on at the time, that it was probably not a wise idea to try to take over from my dad. So that's when the transition kind of started, and they started renting out the land and such. As I say, I've come back, you know, regularly since then, and this has a special place in my heart, and a special place in the family, and a special place in this community, because for years, about in the 70s and 80s, Dad cleared all this area out here, and they would have picnics down here, community picnics, Latimer community picnics. Latimer is the next town just a few miles on east of here, and so it was a place for the community to gather. And they started referring it to Kendalls Grove, which I'd never heard of it before. But apparently they'd had that name associated with this property for years before that, and I just didn't know about it. So anyhow, for us, Kendalls Grove is a special place. The day that my dad died, he had cancer, and we knew he didn't have long to live. We took him a little tour at the farm, and one of the places we stopped was pulling down in here, and he just sat here for a while, and he was looking up at the oak tree, and it really was like communing with the ancestors. And so that was something that we all have kind of etched in our brain, that was Dad's last day, and this was the place that he connected with. So in that sense, it's always going to be there as a special place in our family, and we're really pleased that the Hadens have seen fit to do what they're doing with this land now. And we think Audubon of Kansas is a great organization, and we appreciate, as Gary says, the ability to manage this land. And I've heard good things about Sam. I just met him today, but I think we're in good hands here, and Jackie and the rest of the crew here. So thank you very much, and our family is very pleased, and hope you enjoy your walk along the stream here. So Jackie, back to you.
Well, great. As we wrap up here, I just want to kind of acknowledge Brittany. Brittany Squire is our events and communications person. She organized this tonight. And she wanted me to tell you that the meat was from First Choice Meat in Harrington, and the sides were from B&C Barbecue Wichita. And of course, our board member George LaRue also brought some stuff too. So thanks everybody for that. Want to make sure you introduce the other staff members. Of course, I haven't formally introduced Sam, but Sam Richards is our new Kansas Protected Areas Manager. Catherine Chambers is our Director of Philanthropy. Dave Kirsch is our Chair of the Board. Wave again, not everybody saw you. We have a lot of other board members here. If you're a board member, please stand up. Thank you. Okay, and then some logistics. I did want to mention that Audubon of Kansas is officially going to be receiving this property in December, and so it's not open to the public right now, but once that happens, we'll put it in the Harrington paper, we'll put it on our Facebook page and our newsletter that it's open and where it is, and so everybody can come enjoy this trail and have instructions for how to visit the property. So it's not open right now. This is a special sneak preview, so enjoy your day today.
If people don't get the newsletter, how might they do that?
You can sign up for it on our website, audubonofkansas.org. In the upper right-hand corner, it says subscribe to our newsletter. So you can do that then. Or we do have a sign-up sheet on the side. So you can also just write it there and we'll get you added. Other logistics. So we're gonna break and do some exploring. There is a porta potty over there if you need it. we're going to do some exploring until 3:30. The shuttle is going to run from 3:30 to 4:15. And then 3:30, we'll gather at the parking lot area, and we'll kind of form a chain of cars, and we'll go to the north property. About 3:45 is kind of our target time for that. And then a tour of the north property if you want to stick around and see that. As far as the walks here, I'm Dr. Jackie Augustine. I'll be leading the walk. I'm the executive director. So I'll have one walk, and I'm going to go a medium length. Sam Richards is going to go the farthest. And so if you want to go hiking, go with Sam. You want to go a medium distance with me. And then we have some really awesome insect experts here. And they're going to be kind of wandering around here. So to introduce them, we have Alexi Powell wave, Alexi. There. And then we also have Heidi and Eric Eaton. So Heidi's board member, Eric is the spouse, and he just wrote a book called Bug Watching. And so they have literally, helped contribute to all of our properties at helping identify insects. So they're very knowledgeable. So if you want to find some cool stories about insects, go with them. Otherwise, enjoy, and be back here at 3:30. Thanks.